In 2004, Martin Scorsese and his creative team made a decision to utilise and emulate a rare Technicolor film process for his film The Aviator. This was a bold choice at the time, and by emulating this process, they crafted a nostalgic and immersive visual landscape that reflected the evolving eras of film technology during Howard Hughes' lifetime, enhancing the story's authenticity and adding a nostalgic quality to the film. So on my recent short film, I Hear Jazz in Central Park, I used a look inspired by this retro Technicolor process. And at the end of my previous video, where I broke down the process of shooting that film, I offered to make a tutorial showing you how you can create this old two-strip Technicolor look. So I thought today it'd be really interesting to make a video just diving into exactly what this process is, why it looks the way it does, and then we're going to be going into Davinci Resolve, and then I'm also going to be showing you how to do this in After Effects. Basically, let's have a look at building up a look inspired by this old Technicolor process. So first, let's learn a bit more about it. The process in question was called two-strip Technicolor and was also referred to as the two-color process. It was an early color film technology developed by Technicolor that was primarily used between the early 1920s and early 30s, before being replaced by its successor, the three-strip Technicolor process. This later process is well known for creating the stunning Technicolor looks we associate with classics like The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, and one of my all-time favourites, The Red Shoes. While two-strip Technicolor holds a place in film history and is well known amongst film historians and enthusiasts, given that the process had a relatively short run and fewer widely recognised titles compared to the three-strip process, the two-strip look remains relatively unknown to the general public and many indie filmmakers alike. While a select few films like The Aviator and some games have revisited the striking look, in my estimation, is one of the most unutilised creative looks out there. While I'm sure for those who dislike this look, that would be for a good reason, I'm personally quite fond of it. It's something I've been drawing inspiration on and experimenting with in my own film work since I was a teenager. For an example, here's a clip from a music video I directed for my band when I was 19. I used a two-strip inspired emulation look to create a sort of surreal feel, and also to help balance out the uneven tones brought about by my original footage. So how did two-strip Technicolor work? Essentially, a special camera would shoot two images onto a single strip of black and white film. It did this by using a beam-splitting prism and red and green filters. This captured the red and the green colour information separately. The black and white frames were then dyed using a subtractive colour process. One frame was dyed red and the other was dyed green, or sometimes cyan. These two dyed frames were then combined onto a single, double-sided print, creating the illusion of colour when they were projected. But as this process relied on just red and green, the full colour spectrum could not be reproduced. Most notably, blues, purples and yellows were absent. The result was a unique and stylised look dominated by red and green hues, with limited representation of blues and yellows. So why revisit two-strip in 2025? Two-strip's bold and limited colour palette offers a unique and creative potential. It can evoke a nostalgic or vintage feel, or it can be used to establish an unsettling and otherworldly mood, making it ideal for genres like horror or surrealist films. It's worth noting that in The Aviator, or a lot of these classic films, great care was taken in production and costume design to ensure that everything looked great once this process had been applied. And if you were going to use this for a big production, obviously you'd want to plan the production with that in mind and ideally shoot, monitoring LUTs on set and things like that. So now let's go ahead and have a look at building up some looks inspired by the original two-strip process. I'm going to do this in Davinci Resolve, and I'm also going to show you how we can do this in After Effects, just to show you how you can approach this in a few different editors. Well, there are articles and some great videos on emulating the free strip look created by professional colorists, which I'll link below. I just would really like to stress that today we're focusing on experimenting and looking at this from a creative and stylistic perspective. My goal is just to play around, explore this cool look, and hopefully inspire some people along the way to try and pick this up themselves and see if it's something they can incorporate into their own creative process. Recreating the two-strip look mathematically requires a deep understanding of optical and chemical processes that we're not going to get into today. So instead, we're going to be focusing on an inspired, creative interpretation of what's achievable with modern tools to the average independent filmmaker. So we're here in Davinci Resolve, and I've brought in a clip that I think is going to look really good with this two-strip look. This is from an upcoming web series we're working on, and this particular shot is from an episode set in the 1940s. So as you can see, we kind of have the hair and the costumes, and in this particular shot we've got some nice green grass in the background that I think will look really nice once we've applied this look. So let's go ahead and dive into our color tab and start with this process. So here we are in the color tab, and I'm just going to show you a few different looks here, and then we're going to switch out to After Effects. But essentially the first look is very much inspired by the original two-strip Technicolor analog process. And whilst I'm not going to be obviously completely accurate with it, for one, we're working with a digital image and not a film negative, but I'm essentially going to be building up a node tree inspired by that look that's going to give us a lot of control. So the first thing we're going to do is disconnect this node, and we're just going to make two more nodes here, one called red and one called green. So now we have our red and green node. Essentially what we're going to do is use these two nodes to emulate that black and white film stock which has been exposed using a red or a green filter. So our end goal here is to have one black and white node that only has the red output and a green node that only has the green output. So if we come to our red channel here and we come over to our RGB mixer, you'll see we have control over the red output, the green output and the blue output. And as you see, for the red is on 1 and the others are on 0. For the green, again, the respective green channel is on 1 and the others are on 0, and then the same for the blue. So what we're going to want to do is come over here to our green output. We're going to change the green from 1 to 0 and turn red to 1, and then we're going to come to our blue and turn the blue from 1 to 0 and turn the red to 1. So if we were to go ahead and connect this red node and just quickly see what's happening here, we now have a black and white image where only the red channel is present. So now we're going to do the same but for green. So we're going to come to our red output, we're going to set this to 0, set the green to 1. Green is already outputting green, so we're going to come to our blue and we're going to select the 1 value for blue, turn this to 0, and take the green output for blue and put this to 1. So now again we have the same thing, but this time it's outputting our greens. So another important step here is just to click on our two nodes and make sure we untick Preserve Luminance. And then we can proceed to the next step. I'm going to do this in a slightly unconventional and strange way. One of the main reasons for this is I want to keep this very visual, and I want to build up a node tree that gives beginners a lot of control whilst also being very clear and visual in what it is, and hopefully educating a little bit about the process. Bear in mind, again, like I say, this is inspired by the process and isn't a one-to-one accurate representation of exactly how the analog process would work. But for the purposes of this tutorial, this will be absolutely fine, and is going to get us a really cool look that we're going to have a lot of customization over. So essentially the next step is to replicate the dyeing of these frames. So I'm going to do this by going ahead and creating two more nodes, and I'm also going to make two mixer layers. So if we come here, add node, and I'm going to make layer mixer, and I'm just going to make two of these. So we're going to want to come up to our top layer here, and I'm just going to rename this red solid. And we're going to come down to our bottom one here, and I'm going to call this cyan solid or green solid, depending on what you're using. So now we want basically to generate a color with both of these nodes. So I'm going to come down to our red solid here, and I'm basically going to come onto our effects, and we're going to look for color generator. I'm going to drop this on, and now we're basically going to select our color, and we're just going to set this value so it's 100% red. So where we have green, you see it's 255. We're going to set this to 0. Come to our blue, set this to 0, and hang on, that didn't register, there you go, set that to 0, and as you see we now have a solid red colour. If we just connect this up, it'll just give us a visual representation of that. Let's come to our cyan, we're going to do the exact same thing, but this time we're going to come over to our red and we're going to select 0, and then we're going to keep the blue and the green at 255, and as you see we now have a cyan solid. So now that we have a red solid, a cyan solid, and our isolated red and green black and white image, the next thing to do is to mix them together. So this is where our layer mixer node comes in handy. So we're going to come to our red, we're going to put this into the top input, and we're going to take our cyan, put this into the top input, and then we're also going to take our red and mix this with the red, take our green and mix it with the cyan, and let's go ahead and make some sequence nodes after this so we can see what's happening. So I'm going to click on the layer mixer and press Alt-S, and do this twice. You'll see that nothing has happened, and that's because we haven't set our composite mode in our layer mixer. So if we come to our layer mixer here, come down to composite mode. We now need to blend these frames together. And like I say, because we're not doing a subtractive process, because we're not working with a negative, I'm going to be doing an additive process. So I'm going to select multiply. And as you see, this has dyed our frame red. Now if we come to our second layer mixer, do the exact same thing. So let's go ahead and just isolate these just to see what's going on. So as you see, we now have a red image, and this is a red output dyed red essentially, and then we have a green output dyed cyan. The next step obviously is going to be to mix these two layers together. So we're just going to go ahead and create one final layer mixer. Now at this point you also may just want to rename these real quick. So I'm going to call this red dyed and green dyed. So let's go ahead and take the red and put this into our layer mixer, and then take the green, put this into our layer mixer, and we're now going to select composite mode, screen, and let's go ahead and make one more node, and we'll do this just so that we can have a bit more control over the final image. So I'm going to do the same again, Alt S, and as you see we have some color, so let's go ahead and connect this and see what we're working with. As you see, this has gone ahead and done exactly what we wanted, and we now have a Strip Technicolor inspired look where we essentially have a red and a green dyed frame combined, and this is somewhat similar to the original process, and it's giving us a look again already that, without doing any tweaks, is a very interesting look that is already kind of giving me Aviator vibes. So just one last time to go over our node tree again, just to kind of explain this process. We're taking our image, we're basically splitting it into red and green, and we're isolating just the red output, just the green output, ending up with this black and white image that then we're essentially using a generated solid color to mix with that image to basically make a red and a cyan dyed frame that, when combined together, creates this Strip Technicolor look with limited color spectrum, exactly like the original process. One thing that is very cool that we can do here is we can also change the colors and change the amount of the dye. Now, of course, when they would manually dye these frames back in the day, it wasn't an exact science, and unlike a computer that's able to represent the color perfectly, when you're dealing with analog dyeing processes, often, you know, the green or the red might not actually be completely red or completely green, or might be a weaker color. So what's really cool is that we can come in and we can actually change the color values, or we can correct the dyed images and the hues and things, and we can do this independently for each color channel to end up and kind of blend and get looks that kind of look a bit more unpredictable and a bit more, I guess, analog inspired. And of course we have a node before which we can make corrections on, and a node after that we can kind of make end adjustments on if we need to. So we could always come here and boost our saturation a bit. You know, we could play around with our hues or our white balances and our tones, and obviously there's a lot here that we can kind of do. One bit of advice would be that if you're going to change the hue, do it before you go through the two-strip process. I've noticed that if you come to the end node here and we change the hue, you'll see blue tones being introduced, but if we do it before the process, you'll see that when we get to where those blue tones would be, they're just completely omitted, and it's sticking true to our limited color spectrum. So the first method I just showed you obviously gives us a very visual way to kind of dive in and explore a look inspired by this original process. And obviously I took some creative liberties, but we end up with a nice two-strip look and the ability to go in and kind of change the dyes and tweak the different hues for the individual color channels. I'm now going to show you a way that we can do this, which is unbelievably simple and literally only takes a few clicks, and we're going to end up with essentially the same kind of two-strip inspired look. Now, all of this can be done on one node. I may go ahead later and add a couple nodes, obviously just for correction and adjustments, but just for the sake of showing you this, essentially we're going to take our footage, we're going to come to our RGB mixer, take off preserve luminance, and this time we're only going to be looking at our blue output. Essentially what we're going to do here is swap our blue value to green, and that is going to create that limited color spectrum again, where only the reds and the greens are going to be dominant, and we're going to get that two-strip Technicolor look. So let's go ahead and do that. So we come to our blue here, and we're going to select the value, change this to 0, and as you see everything goes kind of funky. Let's go ahead and select our green and select the value to 1, and as soon as we do this, you see we're straight back to that two-strip Technicolor look. Now just for reference, this is our previous look, and if I go ahead and load this up, you see they're essentially identical. Now obviously with this method we lack the same control, and part of the reason why I showed the previous method was just to kind of create a fun node tree that we could use as a kind of visual aid. If we did want to make some adjustments, one way we could do this is by coming to our blue output, and we could soften this look or kind of tweak the look to our desired result, because obviously it's quite extreme, where we could introduce small amounts of blue. Now obviously we're now going off course of what's kind of accurately inspired by the original process, but this is a really cool kind of way of playing around with your colours and experimenting. So if we come to our blue output here, for example, we can bring our green down manually, and what we could do is then bring our blue up just to offset the changes that we made. And as you see, we start to introduce more colours back into it, but we still have that kind of limited colour spectrum look where our greens are still kind of missing a lot of the blue and the yellow and the purples. And obviously we could work out the values and offset them by the exact amounts, but going back to our previous look, the fact that these original frames would have been dyed by hand, I think if we literally just do it by eye, it kind of can sometimes create these more kind of analog inspired looks. I know for a lot of colorists this will be an absolute nightmare, but just as a fun exercise to kind of play around with limited colour spectrums, this is quite an interesting way to play around with it. We could of course now add on some more nodes here, so we could add a corrector node beforehand, and let's go ahead and add a node after, and we could use this as like a correction, so we could go ahead and label these. So this is 2-strip, this one is correction, this final one could just be for adjustments. And so we could come back, let's say we did want to get that kind of extreme 2-strip Technicolor look, we can just reset our values once again, and we could just come in here and start making adjustments. So we could bring up our saturation and play around with our white balance and things like this. So whilst we'd created a kind of baseline, we can now get into creating and experimenting. And whilst I'm not going to go too far into that in this tutorial, because I think that's the fun part, which I would like to leave up to you as the viewer, should you try this out, to start experimenting and creating your own looks inspired by this original process, I am going to just break down a few node trees that I've created that combine this 2-strip baseline with some more advanced film emulation processes. So I'm very briefly just going to give you a very quick overview of a few different uses of this, and these are just some shots I've kind of grabbed from various different projects out of my hard drive and just kind of have played around making some looks built up using that 2-strip process that we just learned as kind of the core of them, and just showing you a few different ways that we might kind of implement this in some shots. Now some of these are kind of more experimental, more extreme, some are more subtle, but I'll just very quickly run you through them. I'm going to be giving a very quick overview of the node trees I'm using here. This isn't going to be like a deep dive or anything. So the first one is just this shot of me walking through a graveyard from a music video a few years ago, and I decided with this shot I was going to turn it into a kind of found footage inspired, you know, old looking 8mm, this sort of, you know, this would be great to use for kind of a, like I say, a found footage horror where perhaps some old film had been discovered. So I've gone ahead and created a kind of authentic 8mm emulation. And I do have a more detailed video on kind of getting 8mm emulations if anyone's interested on my channel. But essentially here what we're doing is we're blurring the footage on the first node. We're then going into Dehancer for the 8mm emulation, and here we're kind of emulating the film stock, the grain, the bloom, everything that you kind of see, including the film border. And then we're adding a flicker here, which is just giving us that extra kind of, as you see, the flicker in the highlights, which just makes it look even more like it's kind of been projected or scanned. Then we have a sharpen at the end, which is just kind of bringing up our grain and kind of bring up that detail, and it just really helps give it that film look. And then at the very end I've added on our 2-strip Technicolor, as you see, so before and after. And this is an example where if I was making like a horror project, I really feel that to me this kind of limiting color spectrum here does have a kind of more creepy and kind of surreal feel to it. The next shot is one from an upcoming music video project, and as you see I'm just here on this rooftop, and we have a lot of kind of yellows in the green and whatnot, and as soon as we apply this 2-strip look, you see suddenly it almost looks like a different shot. We've really limited the color palette, and I really like how this particular shot looks run through the emulation. And in fact I may even decide to go in this direction for this particular shot when we come to post-production on this final shot. Essentially what I'm doing here is making some corrections to the footage. I'm adding a blur, I'm adding some grain, just using Dehancer, but you could just use the Davinci grain. I'm then using a color space transform here to change it into Rec 709. And then I'm adding our 2-strip, and this is just the RGB mixer method. And then I just have sharpen at the end. If I wanted to kind of drastically change this look even more, I could add on a kind of film stock emulation again. And this has like bloom and halation and stuff, and this will just make it look even kind of older and kind of creepier, kind of like a low budget 70s horror film, which is quite a cool look I'm quite into. But I've kind of gone for this, like I say, Rebel Without a Cause inspired, blurred, grained, and then sharpened kind of film look. Which again, I don't know how to explain better than that. But the next one is more subtle. This is from an upcoming feature film that we're working on, directed by Simon Roper. And essentially here, as you can see, we've just kind of changed the palettes. Here, if I come in, you'll see this is our visual node tree that we made earlier. And then essentially here, I'm just correcting it, blur, very minor, tiny bit of grain here being added, just the stock film grain in Davinci, and then I'm just doing the 2-strip, a small bit of sharpening, and then that's the output. And there you go, that's our final look there. Here's a kind of bleach bypass inspired look, like kind of 90s cinema inspired, and this is from a short film from a couple of years ago called Like Dreamers Do. As you see, we started off like this, and we're going like this, and essentially here I'm doing a color space transform to Cineon log, adding some corrections, going through our 2-strip on the RGB mixer, but as you see I've kind of tweaked the levels a little bit, and then I'm going into a Kodak 2383 film LUT included in Davinci, and then just adding a vignette on the end, because we know everyone loves a vignette. Here, this is how I graded I Hear Jazz in Central Park. Essentially, here's the original shot on the camcorder from my previous video, and then we've turned it into this kind of 2-strip. And as you see, this is kind of inspired, like I say, by the look of the Aviator. And actually here I'm using a node tree which I basically purchased. It's a 16mm, I think it's called like 16mm print. I'll have it on the screen, but essentially it's a really great film emulation that I purchased that someone had put together, and I've just kind of modified it to have a 2-strip look. And whilst it looks quite complicated, it really gives you a lot of control over kind of film emulation, and it's one that I used to use quite a lot, especially around the time I made this film. And then lastly, this is just kind of trying to get a bit closer to that Aviator look with the shot we were working with earlier, where we just have correction, blur, grain, a hue adjustment. As you see, this kind of helps bring that green up into this kind of region. And then we have the 2-strip, some sharpening, and output. So obviously that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. If anyone is interested in any of these looks in particular, I can do deeper dives into either these looks or some of the techniques I mentioned, but essentially there's just a few of, many potential uses for this 2-strip Technicolor process being added into various different kind of experimental or like kind of, I guess, cinematic grades. So here we are in Adobe After Effects, and I've gone ahead and opened up a project, and this is just the cartoon that I put together for the demonstration earlier in the video. You see we've got some basic animation and some 2D layers kind of in 3D space, and the camera kind of going in, giving us a cool kind of perspective effect. And if we wanted to apply 2-strip to this, we could do this in a fairly similar way to the Davinci Resolve methods that I showed you earlier. So I'm basically going to do the same thing, but using a layer-based system instead of a node-based editor, and this will also transfer over to Premiere Pro, so the methods I'm showing you here, you could also do the same thing in Premiere if need be. So we're going to start with the first method, where we're going to isolate our red and our green, and then emulate dye in the frames, and then I'm also going to show you how we can do it much quicker, just shift channel like I did in Davinci. So for that first method, the first thing we're going to want to do is go ahead and duplicate our layer, and I'm just going to hide the top one, and essentially we're going to cool one red and cool one green. So now we have these two layers, we're going to want to go ahead and isolate the color channels. So to do this in After Effects, we select, let's say, we'll just start with our green. It doesn't matter which order you do this in. And we're going to come up to our effects and presets and type in shift channels. And we're going to want to drag this effect onto our layer. And as you see here, we now have the ability to shift and to change where we're taking the red, the green, and the blue from. So if we want the green output, which we do because we're on our green layer right now, then we're going to want to make sure that all of these are taking from the green. So come to our red, select green, come to our blue, select green, and now we have that black and white frame that just has our green output. Let's show our red layer. Let's do the exact same thing, but this time make sure it's all set to red. And so now we have our two layers, red and green. So the next thing to do is emulate that dye process, and to do this we're going to want to generate some solids. So I'm going to come up to our layer here, select new, and we can either select solid and just make a solid color, or if you preferred you can make an adjustment layer and just generate a color onto that. Just for the sake of this tutorial, it doesn't really matter which method we use. I'm going to select solid, and I'm going to come to our color here, click on this, and for our first one it's going to be red, so we're going to keep red at 255, change our green to 0, change our blue to 0, so we have a red. Press OK, and now we have a red solid. Let's just hide this and then do the same but for cyan. So come to our solid here, change our color, and we're going to make sure that the green is set to 255, the blue is set to 255, and we're going to set red to 0. Press OK, and we're going to drag our cyan layer above our green layer. So now essentially we want to combine these two. So if I hide the red layer and I keep our green one visible and I make our cyan visible, as you see here we can toggle our switch to show our blending modes, and essentially we're going to come over to our blending modes, and I'm going to go ahead and change this to multiply. So let's have a look through here, and as you see, multiply up the top, and as soon as I do this we now have that cyan frame. Once we've done this, we want to now combine these two into one layer. So I'm going to go ahead, hold shift, press on our green, we're going to click here and press pre-compose, and I'm going to call this green layer, just like so. And now we want to do the exact same thing for the red, so let's go ahead and show our red layer, come over to our blending mode and change this to multiply, and now we're going to want to highlight, pre-compose, call this our red layer. So now we have our green and our red layer. So now we can come over to our blending mode on the red layer and now change this from normal to screen. And as you see, we now have a 2-strip Technicolor emulation. Now for that second method, I'm going to go ahead and do this actually in our main animation composition. So if we wanted to, we could apply this to an adjustment layer. So I'm going to go ahead and press layer, new, adjustment layer. And then on this adjustment layer, I'm just going to rename this to 2-strip, and we can now go ahead and apply the same exact effect, shift channels, but this time what we're going to do is, instead of changing this all to red and individually isolating our color channels, I'm going to come down to where it says take blue from, and I'm going to change this to green. And as you see, with just one click, we've essentially now got that 2-strip look. Of course, we have much less control this way because in our previous method, we can go in and actually change these solids and actually adjust each color channel separately. But if you just wanted a very quick look, and of course we could then mess around with hues and things after this or add more layers on top. But this is just how we could go ahead and mimic those same exact processes, but in After Effects using a layer-based system. And if you wanted to do this in Premiere Pro, you'd essentially just do the same thing. I think there's an effect built into Premiere Pro called, I think, Color Mixer. I'll leave it on the screen, but essentially you can go in there and basically do the same thing where you just map the blue channel to green output. So there we go. We've had a look at how we can harness the old 2-strip Technicolor process for some color grades and some creative looks. If you're interested in seeing how I've used this in the past, I'll go ahead and leave a link to my latest short film, I Hear Jazz in Central Park, and the music video I mentioned, Fading Away, down in the description below. And lastly, I just wanted to thank everyone for the reception of my previous video on camcorders. Thank you to everyone who subscribed to my channel, who left lovely comments, and also everyone who left creative criticism for me. You know, it's a great way of knowing how to grow and getting an idea of the feeling and the demand of people watching the videos. Going forward, I'm thinking of making some videos on other aspects of the filmmaking process. I trained as an actor, and that's my primary profession, so I'm very keen to do some videos diving into acting process, but also as a director, I'm keen to do some films talking more about the creative side of making films and hopefully inspiring people to make their own. I also used to work as a professional visual effects artist, so if anyone is interested, I can do some After Effects or Unreal Engine tutorials and sort of show you how you can perhaps approach After Effects or visual effects as a beginner, or I can do some more advanced tutorials if there's an interest and an audience for it. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.